Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon master lecture, a very male name for this particular lecture. Just wanted to note that. I'm Judith Zimmerbrand from Naropa University, and I'm delighted to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Erin McCarthy. Erin is chair and professor of philosophy at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, where she also teaches in the Asian Studies program. A comparative feminist philosopher, in her work and teaching, she brings together Japanese philosophy, ethics, feminist and continental philosophy. Author of the book Ethics Embodied, Rethinking Selfhood Through Continental, Japanese, and Feminist Philosophies, her work has been published in several anthologies and journals in both French and English. Her current research looks at medieval Japanese philosopher Dogen as a resource for contemporary feminist philosophy, and another strand integrates feminist and contemplative pedagogies. One of the things about Erin that's so unusual is she really sits at the confluence of feminist, philosophy, and contemplative, extremely rare to bring those particular strands together. She was an inaugural recipient of the Frederick P. Lenz Foundation Residential Fellowship for Buddhist Studies in American Culture and Values at Naropa University in 2009, which is how I got to know her. I got to work very closely with her for the semester that she spent at Naropa University. She sits on the editorial boards of the journals Comparative and Continental Philosophy, the Journal of Japanese Philosophy, and Body and Religion, and is co-editor of the Asian Network Exchange, a journal for Asian studies, and the liberal arts. She has also served as chair of the board of directors of Asian Network. She's a founding member of Co-Zen, a group dedicated to the cooperative integration of contemplative practice and academic study. She's also a trained mindfulness instructor and has completed the Mindful Schools curriculum training, and she's a teacher in the Mindful Self-Compassion program. So wonderful credentials in all the areas of feminism, philosophy, and contemplative teaching. So I'm delighted to introduce my friend. One thing I have to say is she's also a very special human being, lots of fun, and so brilliant and so deep. And so I'm really delighted to introduce her today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Judith. That was a really, really lovely introduction. And so, all right, this talk was going to take a slightly different angle before this week happened. And inspired by the events of this week and by Rhonda's talk this morning, we're going to go in a somewhat different direction. So I think it'll become clear. As it says in the abstract, what I think is that integrating a comparative, oh, and by the way, I'm a philosopher, so I don't have charts and studies. I have quotations. That's it. So in the first part of the presentation, what I want to do is sketch out the synergies between feminist and Buddhist philosophies. Contemplative studies and its subfield, contemplative education, share these Buddhist roots. And the second part of the talk, I'll gesture towards putting the philosophical reflections on Buddhism and feminism into practice, looking at how these philosophies might inform contemplative education. And this part of my work was very much inspired by the time I spent at Naropa. So gratitude for all the things and people I met while I was there. So I want to look at how these philosophies might inform contemplative education so that a feminist voice is incorporated in the theoretical and philosophical foundations of this growing field, urging it to be a pedagogy that is liberatory for all. So what the practice philosophy of Buddhism, and here I focus on the tradition I'm most familiar with, which is Zen, what it provides us with are resources that, when brought into dialogue with issues of injustice, the oppression of women, advance feminism by giving voice to those who have suffered and helps make the world a more compassionate place, one in which everyone has a chance at relieving suffering. So my aim is to advance both fields and bring them into a conversation that hasn't happened enough yet, I think. Traditionally, with its tendency towards dualistic thinking, Western philosophy has marginalized the body and deemed it inferior to mind. Much feminist philosophy critiques this sort of dualism, and so it makes sense to turn towards a non-dualistic tradition, such as those in Buddhism, for ways to rethink body to make it non-limiting for women. Now, links between feminism and Buddhism date back, I think, almost to its birth. Although the Buddha initially refused to ordain women, expressed a general reluctance to do so, and imposes extra precepts in the 8 heavy rules on female monastics, the fact remains that in the end he did fully ordain women, at a time in which most other religious traditions did not. So while there may be legitimate grievances to be raised about the way in which Buddhism has treated women, the Buddha's decision to ordain women was radical and speaks to what I find to be a deep, abiding openness and sense of equality in the tradition. Now, this is not to suggest that Buddhism has been immune to patriarchy. Women have been viewed as inferior simply by virtue of being women in Buddhism as elsewhere. And the prevailing misogyny of Indian culture at the time of the Buddha did not disappear when he declared that women too could become enlightened. And it's important not to romanticize Buddhism or these other contemplative practices as a panacea. We cannot ignore the women whose names were left off the lineage charts, the women whose work was and often continues to be invisible, nor can we ignore the way women's questions down the centuries have been marginalized in Buddhist traditions as they have in the West. And although feminism has a lot to teach Buddhism, the opposite is also true. Buddhism and feminist philosophy are congenial rather than antithetical. Buddhist philosophy provides non-dualistic frameworks that feminist philosophy, I think, searches for. So viewing Buddhism from the standpoint of feminism can help free it from its patriarchal past and allow it to face up to the harmful things that have been said or done in the name of Buddhism or helping someone attain enlightenment, and recover the openness and egalitarianism which the Buddha expressed. So I see what I'm doing here is, in fact, honoring the tradition, reappropriating the past, performing what Rita Gross calls a feminist revalorization of the Buddhist tradition. Gross says to revalorize is to have determined that however sexist a religious tradition may be, it is not irreparably so. Revalorizing is, in fact, doing that work of repairing the tradition, often bringing it much more in line with its own fundamental values and vision than was its patriarchal form. So this requires the sort of praxis that inspires both Buddhism and feminism and contemplative education. Putting ideas into action, seeing what works, what doesn't, and returning to refashion the theory over and over again to ensure that it's truly liberatory. It's in this spirit that I attempt to revalorize the views of women's bodies in Buddhism in light of contemporary feminist philosophies. So French feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray contends that in our current society, the body, also called microcosm, has been cut off from the universe, which is called macrocosm. The body is no longer educated to develop its perception spiritually, but to detach itself from the sensible for a more abstract, more speculative culture. When she calls for a redefining of philosophy, Irigaray suggests that philosophy take on a plural meaning. In a tone reminiscent of the goals of contemplative studies, she argues that this possible interpretation would imply that philosophy joined together more than it has done in the West, the body, the heart, and the mind. That it not be founded on contempt for nature, that it not resort to a logic that formalizes the real by removing it from concrete experience, that it be less a normative science of truth than the search for measures that help in living better with oneself, with others, with the world. In the way of love, Irigaray encourages us to rethink the kind of self that is something fixed or static, and urges us to explore the dimension of ourselves where being still quivers, where identity is never definitively constituted nor defined beforehand. It's elaborated in relation with. It's a view of no self. Irigaray's idea of selfhood as relational and embodied finds support in what Zen Buddhism has said all along. Here, the body is viewed as necessary for knowledge, though knowledge here is construed differently as well. And there's an emphasis in much of Zen and Japanese philosophy in general on lived experience, in which the body is included as philosophically significant, and bodily wisdom is something to be cultivated and developed. David Shaner tells us that mind and body are inseparably connected, and as a result, the body serves as a vehicle for, not a detriment to, the direct experience of truth. The history of philosophy is full of examples of denying the body. It's what keeps us from enlightenment and knowledge rather than what gets us there. In Watsuji Tetsuro's work, which was strongly influenced by Zen Buddhism, especially by the medieval philosopher Dogen, and his concept of the human being as ningen, we also find echoes of this quivering of being that Irigaray advocates, the idea that subjectivity is open to the other rather than closed off from it. So the Japanese character for ningen is made up of two characters, the character for individual and for between. So this signifies that as individuals, as human beings, as ningen, we are both individual and social at the same time. We're interconnected in our very being. In fact, ningen literally means between persons, and this is a helpful way to think about Watsuji's concept. For him, ningen, this concept of human being, is not to be understood as a thing or as a substance, but more like a place or a space, and yet not a fixed place. It's more like a shifting network of relations that are continually configured and reconfigured in time and space. So this sense and this importance of body-mind also appears in much of the contemplative studies and contemplative education literature. As we've been seeing here over the last couple of days, scholars stress the importance of this deep interconnectedness with other human beings to pedagogy. In applying contemplative studies to the liberal arts, for example, Hal Roth echoes what Watsuji refers to as an interpenetration of consciousnesses and the non-dualism in Irigaray and Zen, when he suggests that human cognition is not at all a subjective representation of an objective world. Rather, it's the constantly shifting enactment of a myriad of worlds of experience that are context interactive, like we heard Rhonda talk about this morning, simultaneously subjective and objective. As he advocates, the goal of contemplative studies is to cultivate wisdom through deepening one's relationship to the world and encourage compassion and empathy through an understanding of the interconnection of all life. But to do this, we need to do what Rhonda spoke about this morning, about going back to the social historical context that shaped this tradition, out of which much of our work, where much of our work finds its roots. And so I'm going to go back to look at the ways women's bodies in Buddhism have been portrayed. So although philosophically Buddhism maintains that the enlightened body is beyond gender, the tradition has invariably presented the enlightened body as male. As Miriam Levering points out, as in the case of the God of Western theology, sophisticated Buddhists knew that Buddhas were in some sense beyond gender, yet they said repeatedly that a male body presented him best to the human imagination, and many would certainly have been startled by a reference to the Buddha as female. So, the Buddha's decision to fully ordain women notwithstanding, the door was still left open to speculations about the limitations of the female nature, a theme prominent in the androcentric and misogynist views that were to become increasingly characteristic of the tradition as the monastic order became more institutionalized and male-dominated in the first several centuries following Shakyamuni's death. And there's no shortage of literature, particularly in early Buddhism, that states unequivocally that in order to become enlightened, one must first possess a male body. So for example, the Sutra on Changing the Female Sex. If women can accomplish one thing, dharma, they will be freed of the female body and become sons. What is that one thing? The profound state of mind which seeks enlightenment. Why? If women awaken to the thought of enlightenment, then they will have the great and good person's state of mind, a man's state of mind, a sage's state of mind. If women awaken to the thought of enlightenment, then they will not be bound to the limitation of a woman's state of mind. Because they will not be limited, they will forever separate from the female sex and become sons. Okay. So Diana Paul actually points out that at the time, this was really liberating for women because she could free herself, I'm quoting Paul here, from her sexual nature without postponing her becoming a bodhisattva until a rebirth as man. So she was no longer biologically determined by her body. She wasn't a victim of her bodily needs. She emerges from her sexual identity as a female by mentally becoming a man in this lifetime. So this is kind of radical. However, Paul also points out that this is ambiguous. Innate psychological characteristics of maleness and femaleness are denied philosophically, since females can change into males psychologically, yet the male symbol is still ranked higher than the female, and women have to exert more effort to overcome their physical needs. So even when women are said not to require transformation into male form, they still aren't equal as women. Equality here only attaches to men. In the early sutras, we also find women ranked lower than men because of their body. So from the Angutarra Sutra, monks, I see no other single form so enticing, so desirable, so intoxicating, so binding, so distracting, such a hindrance to winning the unsurpassed peace from effort as a woman's form. Monks, whosoever clings to a woman's form, infatuated, greedy, fettered, enslaved, enthralled, for many a long day shall grieve, snared by the charms of a woman's form. Monks, a woman, even when going along, will stop to ensnare the heart of a man, whether standing, sitting, or lying down, laughing, talking, or singing, weeping, stricken, or dying. A woman will stop to ensnare the heart of a man. Verily, one may say of womanhood, it is wholly a snare of the tempter Mara. So on the one hand, the Buddha is cautioning against desire and attachment, and thereby underlining his teaching on the 5 skandhas, right? That what we consider to be ourself, including the form in which we find ourselves embodied in this lifetime, is not permanent. And so it ought not to be an object of attachment. But on the other hand, the passage goes beyond saying that monks should not be attached to the form of women, to imply that woman's form itself is somehow evil, that there is something inferior, even inherently bad, about women's bodies. And the image of woman as a temptress entrapping men is nefarious. The claims about the form of woman, her rupa, quickly give way to generalizations about what it is to be a woman, posing a threat to man no matter what she is doing. Now, Alan Sponberg goes on to cite several examples from other sutras which express the view that women can ruin the precepts of purity, women are more detestable than the dead dog or snake, that because of them one falls into evil ways, there is no refuge, and so on. But as Mahayana develops, the concept of emptiness develops, to reaffirm, Sponberg tells us, the early principle of soteriological inclusiveness, some factions were inspired to develop that original principle towards a much more actively egalitarian view, an affirmation of non-dualistic androgyny, which has strong roots in the newly emerging Mahayana philosophy of emptiness. Take, for example, the Vimalakirti Sutra, which is one of my favorites. So after Shariputra, poor Shariputra, asks an enlightened goddess living in the house to change out of her female state or form into a male state, assuming that any woman would naturally want to do so to prove her enlightenment. We read the goddess say, "For the past 12 years, I've been trying to take on female form, but in the end with no success. What is there to change? If a sorcerer were to conjure up a phantom woman and then someone asked her why she didn't change out of her female body, would that be any kind of reasonable question?" Shariputra says, well, no, phantoms have no fixed form, so what would there be to change? The goddess says, all things are just the same. They have no fixed form, so why ask why I don't change out of my female form? And at that time, the goddess employs her supernatural powers, boom, changes Shariputra into a goddess like herself while she takes on Shariputra's form. Then she says, why don't you change out of this female body to Shariputra? Now, in the form of a goddess, Shariputra, he's like, I don't know why I've suddenly changed and taken on a female body. And the goddess says, Shariputra, if you can change out of this female body, then all women can change likewise. Shariputra, who is not a woman, appears in a woman's body. And the same is true of all women. Though they appear in women's bodies, they are not women. Therefore, the Buddha teaches that all phenomena are neither male nor female. The goddess then withdraws her supernatural powers, and Shariputra gets returned to his original form. The goddess said to Shariputra, "Where now is the form and shape of your female body?" Shariputra says, "The form and shape of my female body does not exist, yet does not exist." The goddess says, "All things are just like that. They do not exist, yet do not exist. And that they do not exist, yet do not exist is exactly what the Buddha teaches." So we notice here that the goddess refuses to transform herself into a male body initially because all forms are ultimately empty. The goddess mocks Shariputra for clinging to form. Whether one is in a female or male embodiment is immaterial, as she so deftly illustrates by switching bodies with him. She has no need to embody a male form to demonstrate her enlightened state. So our outward embodiments are impermanent and empty. From the perspective of an enlightened being, one's form is immaterial, so focusing on the supposed necessity of being embodied in male form to be enlightened is, as she so effectively demonstrates here, nonsense. And yet, okay, it's not important either. And that's what I love about this. It demonstrates that your embodied form in this particular lifetime matters. If we jump ahead several centuries, we see the effect of this emphasis on emptiness regarding attitudes towards women in the work of medieval Japanese philosopher Dogen. Now, it might seem odd to draw on a 12th century Zen master to promote the aims of contemporary feminism, but I've got a couple pieces out about this. And Dogen's views about women, as I've urged elsewhere, are feminist. He does not think that by virtue of being women, anyone is less capable of attaining enlightenment. Nor does he think that women's bodies are the cause of the downfall of monks on the path to enlightenment or inherently impure or evil. So in contrast to the 8 Garudhammas, or heavy rules, the special rules the Buddha put in place when he established the female monastic order, the one that says when monks and nuns are together, monks are always above nuns, even the most senior nun, he says this: "If you encounter someone who maintains the great Dharma, having received the acknowledgement, you have attained my marrow. Whether the person is a pillar or a lantern, a Buddha, wild fox, demon, man, or woman, you should keep your body and mind on the zazen seat and attend to the person even for immeasurable eons. Anyone who clings blindly to rules and regulations, even those attributed to the Buddha, does not, according to Dogen, truly understand the Buddha way. He calls them foolish people who have neither seen nor heard the Buddha way." And he also says a comment that we really need to hear at the moment, I think, that those who are extremely stupid think that women are merely the objects of sexual desire and treat women in this way. The Buddha's children should not be like this. 12th century, still. One of the other great resources is Dogen's non-dualism. Dogen's teachings about women are representative of his radical non-dualism, Zen's not one, not two. Ultimately in Zen, both body and mind drop off, and the enlightened being is said to be beyond gender. But Zen's non-duality means that one's gender does not simply get discarded. As Taigen Dan Leighton explains, Dogen's non-duality is not about transcending the duality of form and emptiness. This deeper non-duality is not the opposite of duality, but the synthesis of duality and non-duality, with both included and both seen as ultimately not separate, but as integrated. The with both included, this not one, not two of Zen, is of particular interest for feminist philosophy. For too often, woman's subjectivity is subsumed by man's subjectivity. And we can think about this in terms of race as well. In the guise of oneness or universality, or can't we all just get along? And difference gets left out entirely. By contrast, the non-duality we find in Dogen and Zen holds open a space for difference without falling prey to the harmful dualisms that place one gender or race or class or sexuality in a position of power or privilege over another. Iris Marion Young describes the harm this thinking can do as follows. The feminine signifies a relational position in a dichotomy of masculine-feminine, where the first is more highly valued than the second, and where the second is partly defined as a lack with respect to the first. So you don't even have your own subjectivity, as Simone de Beauvoir pointed out so many years ago. And this lines up with those other dichotomies that have a hierarchical logic: mind-body, reason-passion, white-black, public-private, heterosexual, everything else, right? Hard science, soft science, and dozens of other value-laden dichotomies whose discursive application has practical effects in personal lives, workplaces, media imagery, and politics. So we've already seen how this hierarchical logic affected women in Buddhism, and how Dogen Zen rejects this hierarchical logic. So to illustrate what revalorization through comparative feminist philosophy looks like, I want to turn to one of the most pervasive images in Buddhism, that of maternal imagery, with a focus on the maternal body. So early Mahayana introduces the Tathagatagarbha or Buddha womb teaching. Tathagata meaning the enlightened one or the thus come one, and Garbha is Sanskrit for womb. The sutra reads, here I see, this is a selection from the sutra, I see with my Buddha kakshar that in the bodies of all beings there lies concealed the Buddha Garbha. I see that all kinds of being have a Buddha Garbha hidden by kleshas. I see that all beings are like infants in distress. Within their bodies is the Tathagatagarbha, but they do not realize it. So I tell bodhisattvas, be careful not to consider yourselves inferior. Your bodies are Tathagatagarbhas. They always contain the world's light of saving grace. So the womb of the Buddha is within every body. In fact, it is every body, the sutra tells us. And we notice not the seed, not the sperm, but the womb, right? We might expect something else of a tradition with patriarchal tendencies, but it's the womb. So the whole of this lengthy sutra, directed to male monastics, is focused on something that is unique to women's embodiment. For it's by virtue of containing the womb of the Buddhas that the bodies themselves contain the world's light of saving grace. Now, true, this view is hard to square with other sutras that call the vagina the mouth of poisonous black snakes, or charcoal pits of blazing fire, two of my favorites. But if we read this passage through contemporary lenses, we begin to see how we might revalorize it and use it to support and advance feminism in the tradition. So bringing feminist philosophy into the conversation here, revalorizing the texts, recovering women's bodies to see them also as sources of enlightenment, is one among the multiplicity of awakening and healing meanings that can emerge from texts such as these. And yet, we need to proceed with caution. As Laura Green observes, feminist philosophers who wish to revalorize the maternal body in this way face a dilemma. The question seems to be one of conceptual comportment. What would it mean philosophically to take the female embodied self, particularly in its capacity for birthing as norm, whilst at the same time resisting any claim to authenticity? Furthermore, how might this be achieved without turning woman into a utopian, sentimentalized, and abstract category, and one which is somehow also unknowable, right? We've seen that happen. Women can't do this or that because they're so precious, right? They must be protected and honored. No. This, in fact, is what seems to have happened in the Buddhist tradition. Once the maternal body is deliberately disconnected from real women and their experience, it's turned into an abstract category for men, almost something mysterious, rather than being a source of valorization for women. So bringing a feminist philosophical perspective into conversation here opens a way forward to not get stuck in any one conceptualization of feminine or masculine or anything in between. I'd like to contend, as Dogen urges, but to still acknowledge difference and the lived experience of being in the myriad of differently sexed bodies that we inhabit. So this can ensure, I think, that we neither end up essentializing women or bodies or making them so mysterious and abstract. So Dogen's non-dualism, I think, is one helpful starting point. Rereading the way maternity is characterized in this sutra and in other Buddhist texts allows us to extend our thinking, allowing us to conceive of the maternal as extending beyond the bearing of children. Irigaray writes about that we give birth to all sorts of things, political things, artistic things, things well beyond children. And we can explore how woman might make or find meaning in this expanded, enlightened notion of maternity, whether or not she actually bears children, and how this might be liberatory. Tathagatagarbha becomes a metaphor that includes women in the creative maternal dimension rather than excluding them. And where does this come from? It comes from, what is it about women that can give birth? It comes from the womb. It needs to be empty, and it empties itself every month in order to create life. Sometimes it's closed, sometimes it's open. Mostly we can say it's not quite closed. And the womb is the source for all human beings in the world. Furthermore, it's a place where mother and child, self and other, are intimately interconnected, but at the same time where each maintains its difference. French philosopher Luce Irigaray writes about this alternative to dualistic subject-object relations as the placental economy. In this model, the mother's self and the other that is the embryo manage to negotiate the space of the same and the other, and the difference between self and other is continually negotiated. Being quivers. Being still quivers in this space. Drawing on the Buddhist concept of emptiness, Japanese philosopher Nishida Kotaro's explanation of absolute nothingness sounds strikingly similar to the placental economy, a place wherein there is deep interdependence and yet difference is maintained. As Brett Davis explains it, the alterity in Nishida's view of the other person is thus recognized not by way of penetrating laterally through the walls of the ego, but rather by way of passing through an opening in one's own depths. I paradoxically encounter the irreducible exteriority of the other person in the depths of myself, so the difference is maintained. I discover that all others are always already in me, so there's deep interconnectedness. This inclusion of alterity is not a reduction of the other to the self. To the contrary, it's an originary expropriation of the self. In its innermost depths, the self is exposed to alterity, and so to know oneself is to be open to others, and this is what we discover in practice. The space of nothing, the space of wisdom, where the other is in me, can be symbolized as womb. It's an emptiness as a place which two come together as one without either subsuming the other. It's in this nothing where we find the ground of all distinctions and at the same time discover the non-duality of self and other. And as I read them, Irigaray and Nishida both conceptualize the kind of emptiness that Buddhism maintains is the source of all creation, the source of enlightenment, the Tathagatagarbha. And so before gesturing towards how this applies to the classroom, I want to turn from text to an image. So I'd like to suggest that we read the enso, the iconic Japanese Zen symbol of emptiness, as womb. The enso is sometimes closed, sometimes open. It's a source of life and creativity, and each one is unique. As John Lurie explains, on the one hand, it is just a circle painted with one brush stroke in a single breath. On the other hand, it is the representation of the totality of the great void. And it is that emptiness of the womb, of the enso, that is the source of life and out of which everything is born. It's the source, we might say, of that maternal creative dimension that Irigaray talks about, which, if we bring feminist philosophy together with Buddhism, belongs to everyone. If we bring the image of the enso with feminist philosophical thought and with the revalorizing of women's bodies and the maternal in Buddhism, as I have suggested here, we can begin to revalorize the body in the tradition in a way that is liberatory. Imagined this way, the maternal creative dimension of being, the Tathagatagarbha, is inherent in all beings, and we honor its roots in the female body, its source in the female body, rather than forgetting, denying, repressing, or universalizing it out of existence. After this rereading, this revalorizing, anyone can look at women's bodies and see a concrete exemplar worthy of emulation, regardless of gender. At the same time, the female body becomes worthy of our esteem rather than our disgust. And finally, women can see in the enso the source of the saving grace of all beings in themselves. And so I want to turn now to the pedagogical convergences, where contemplative education and feminist pedagogy come together. I believe that if we can do the reimagining of the sort that I've just suggested, that we can move closer to what Arthur Zions points to when he makes the claim that contemplative education is an education in and out of love, suggesting that knowing itself remains partial and deformed if we do not develop and practice an epistemology of love instead of an epistemology of separation. And so what are the practical tools we have for doing this? I think we heard one beautiful Black feminist pedagogy this morning in Rhonda McGee's talk, in her way of color insight practice. But with the time that remains, I want to just briefly sketch out the synergies between contemplative education and pedagogy, because feminist pedagogy has been around and used since the 1980s, and I think that there are great resources for contemplative education to draw on here. Again, so that the voices of people who have been working for social justice don't get left out as the field develops, but so that this work instead informs the field as it grows. So contemplative education and feminist pedagogies also share much in common, as feminist pedagogy, which took root as an offshoot of other liberatory pedagogies, started in the 80s. So first of all, they both use embodied pedagogies. Feminist and liberatory pedagogies brought the body back as a source of wisdom into the classroom. As Bell Hooks urges in her brilliant and inspiring 1994 book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, the Academy has traditionally forced us to think of ourselves dualistically, to carve out a distinction between the intellectual and emotional, the mind and the body, and encourages the separation of our professional intellectual lives and our personal or private lives. She calls for an intellectual questing for a union of body, mind, and spirit. She tells us that the objectification of the teacher within bourgeois educational structures seemed to denigrate the notion of wholeness and uphold the idea of that mind-body split, one that promotes and supports compartmentalization. Now, as she emphasizes, pursuing this vision does not mean checking one's intellectual or critical faculties at the door, and we heard that in Hal Roth's talk yesterday as well. To the contrary, the aim is to recognize that purely intellectual questing is partial, and that the goals of education, including the development of intellect, can be better advanced by cultivating the body-mind in the classroom in order to achieve the full development of our students. Hooks contends that as professors, our work is not merely to share information, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. In addition to embodied pedagogies, feminist standpoint epistemology's impact on the pedagogy also brought subjectivity into the classroom over 2 decades ago, challenging in the same way that contemplative education often does, the traditional third-person, top-down way of learning and integrating a critical first-person perspective into the classroom. As feminist philosophy teaches us, we all bring our subjectivity into the classroom and bring it to bear on learning even in the purest intellectual endeavors. As feminist standpoint epistemology has shown us in particular, ignoring this dimension of learning or investigating has resulted in oppression and the silencing of voices. The hidden curriculum is what takes over, right? This is how you behave. This is how you have to mold your body. So paying attention to the bodies in our classrooms is really important. Paying attention to who is doing the sitting if we're asking students to sit, and what they might be experiencing and bringing into the classroom. I think feminist pedagogies and philosophy have a lot to add to the story, because as I said earlier, contemplative practices can end up being bypassing, right? And they're not a panacea for racism, sexism, or homophobia. What contemplative practices can do, oh, sorry, I forgot this stuff. Oh, where did it go? So we have the idea of no self in Buddhism, which is explained as individual persons and their consciousness do arise and therefore are not entirely non-existent, but they exist only in relation to their bodies, to other individuals, and to all non-self entities in their surroundings. Gieran Chelberg put it this way: you wouldn't be the person you are if your family, friends, and acquaintances all weren't the people they are. Rhonda sort of talked about this morning. If you hadn't had the experiences you've had, lived in the society you live in, and so on. In feminist philosophy, in the work of Judith Butler, we hear this: when the I seeks to give an account of itself, it can start with itself, but it will find that this self is already implicated in a social temporality that exceeds its own capacities for narration. Indeed, when the I seeks to give an account of itself, an account that must include the conditions of its own emergence, it must, as a matter of necessity, become a social theorist. The reason for this is that the I has no story of its own that is not also the story of a relation, or set of relations to a set of norms. So this no self view we can read as a relational self. And then in feminist relational theory, the relational theory offers an important and informative framework for feminist pedagogy because it starts from the claim that the human self is fundamentally relational, as we see in interdependence in Buddhism, as we see in Watsuji's notion of ningen, and so on, right? And in Butler. So there's this range of relationships that influence and shape us, and this is what constitutes this self that we think of as individual. And yet, as Gross points out, while most Buddhists do not believe in the existence of a permanent abiding self, their attitudes and actions nevertheless indicate that they do believe in the real existence of gender. Now, feminism and Buddhism and contemplative studies and contemplative education share several goals. They share the goal of liberating people from suffering. Feminist and Buddhist philosophies and contemplative studies all seek to relieve suffering as one of their goals. Feminist pedagogy is liberatory, it's often experiential, it's engaged teaching and learning, it's engaged with others to get beyond our sexism and racism and classism and homophobia and other destructive hatreds, and to work together to enhance our knowledge. It's engagement with self in a continual reflective process. And it's engagement with others in creating community. Persons connected in a net of relationships with people who care about each other's learning as well as their own. So this feminist pedagogy could equally describe contemplative pedagogies, where the web of interrelationships in the classroom is seen to stretch to the local, regional, and global communities, and potentially even beyond the boundaries of our Earth. This, you recall, is much like what Hal Roth said in a key article in the Teachers College Record in 2006, where he said, "We've reached a moment in history when it is time to re-envision certain basic aspects of the existing models of teaching and research in higher education in order to foster a deeper knowledge of the nature of our existence as human beings in a world that is intricately interrelated on many levels." So integrating feminist pedagogy into contemplative education, I think, can really harness the power of the practices and can help us combat issues of social justice that need to be fought now maybe more than ever. So feminist pedagogy can be seen as a movement against hegemonic educational practices that tacitly accept or more forcefully reproduce an oppressively gendered, classed, racialized, and androcentric social order. And so what contemplative practices can do, if we keep in mind the historical social context that's at the root of the Buddhism that informs many of these practices, what contemplative practices can do, and this is why I think it's absolutely essential in this moment in time, especially when informed by feminist and other critical pedagogies that recognize the intersectionality of race, class, and gender, is help us hold space for recognizing not only our own suffering and the suffering of others, but also to hold and see those times when we have participated in systems of oppression, when we've treated someone as an object, a body, not a person, and not to look away from doing that, but to face those truths, to acknowledge them and be accountable for change. So in the last few days, my Facebook newsfeed has been full of stories that my friends are sharing about women's bodies being attacked for being female, for being immigrant, for being Muslim, for being people of color, for being people who don't conform to gender norms. I think that these incidences are a result of a perpetuation of epistemologies of fear, not love, of places where being is not allowed to quiver, but where it's fixed in place. If we can cultivate a place where women are no longer seen as objects of shame or derision or sexual gratification or property, or any bodies for that matter, but as worthy not only of emulation, but acknowledging that that's in us, in each one of us, regardless of our outward embodiment, that it's someone we want to be, that the world's light of saving grace is in us, and can cultivate practices in the classroom that can help us break down the self-other binary without losing the sense of self, without losing indifference, the not one, not two of Zen, without essentializing the other, being deliberate as this field of contemplative studies continues to grow, deliberate in our inclusion of awareness of issues of gender, race, and class. Through letting a polyphony of voices be heard, we can, I think, cultivate the kind of caring, compassionate education that can help reduce the suffering of all beings in this world. Thank you very much. Whew. Thank you. So we have some time for questions or stunned silence. I'm good with both. Yes.
Hello. Okay. So I guess in terms of the valorization of Buddhism from a feminist perspective, or of feminism from a Buddhist perspective, less so maybe, is there a risk of superimposing a kind of felt duality onto the teachings of emptiness?
Can you tell me a little bit more?
So I guess I'm thinking of an example might be of if you're talking about the feminist incorporation of the body into a practice of insight, of obtaining insight. That kind of focus, in particular, might draw attention away from the actual insight, or not the insight itself, but the emptiness of the mind and body. So, like, I understand that there's been that the feeling is there's been a focus on the mind over the body.
Right.
But is the answer to that a focus on the body?
Right, great question. Okay. No. I think that we need to make sure that we don't focus just on the body instead of the mind. It has to be both. But this can be done in things like, sitting instructions, right? Something as simple as instructing people how to seat, how to sit, right? Women's bodies are different from men's. I was once told sitting to, clench my sphincter and do this, and it's like, okay, that's kind of strange, but whatever. And there's enough women in here who will know what I'm talking about, so I'm just gonna be out there with it. But when I thought about, sort of tightening my Kegel muscles, I was like, oh, so paying attention to the bodies doesn't mean to the exclusion of the mind. It just means helping those bodies being more able to experience non-duality. And I do think that if what would happen? I don't know, what would happen if we imagined, even if you don't have a womb, if you imagine you have a womb, right? Would that help in the sitting practice to embody emptiness?
It's an interesting question. I just get concerned about people overextending to their own perception of like this drawback, this pulling and pushing against a strong duality in one direction to a strong duality in another.
Yeah, well, that's definitely. I hope that's not what I suggested. So, because I agree with you.
You were careful. I think
Oh,
you were
good.
careful. A nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It really speaks to the philosophical side of me being a clinical scientist. So I have some kind of rudimentary understanding of the philosophy and also the Buddhist cosmology mentioned. So as I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ananda was the disciple that actually advocated and pushed Buddha to do it, right?
Yep.
And not that Buddha did it unwillingly, but Ananda had to apologize at the first council. And then later was rolled back, and then emptiness, then come in to rescue that. What the original thing was, like you said, it's not about resisting, pushing, and pulling, but it's empty. What are we arguing about? So the thing, then tying back to feminist theory, if I were to pull queer theory back in as a close cousin, I have a question about evolution and stress adaptation. So my department focuses on seeing clinical science as stress and adaptation, which is very functional and incidental, in the sense that our planet happens to have oxygen, blah, 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 and we use sexual reproduction to, whatever. So all these stuff that you mentioned are still kind of remnant and tied to the struggles back in Buddha's time. Mm-hmm. But we have smartphone technology. Our consciousness are literally transformed in different space and access mechanisms. So that means our adaptations are different. We had a Google smart cars person come in and talk to us about policy, and then people were rejoiced about how, then we're gonna have so much time doing work in this stuff. And I'm like, but what about neuroadaptation? Now, what about our awareness? Are we gonna pay as much attention to our surrounding? Are we gonna be hyper-focused? So the same thing with queer theory talks about the omniscient kind of awareness to power, boundary, stuff that construct, but not just any boundary, but the boundary that has functional impact on our survival at a certain time and space. Mm-hmm. To generalize this, I wonder if what you're saying are kind of universally applicable, or it's just applicable to certain problems that we're experiencing.
Okay, wow, lots.
Are you?
Am I what?
No, just are you?
So I think queer theory has a lot to bring to bear here. I think right now, the work that I'm doing in the context of feminist philosophy is really trying to make sure that we don't bypass the bodies who have been silenced and the voices that have been silenced. And I think that fits right in with queer theory. I mean, there's only so much time. So I think you're right. So my particular work at this particular moment in time for this particular paper is really talking about, let's make sure that we do not oppress any more voices as this continues. I think when we start talking about universalizing, we have to be very careful.
Thank you. That actually answers my question about the body being our struggle right now. But if we transcend this body business, maybe it's another struggle.
Maybe it's another struggle, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but right now I don't think we've transcended this. But we're going. Yes.
Hi. You've answered this in part. The answer might be kind of obvious, but I was curious to hear about why you ended up deciding to pursue this line of inquiry, or it could just be something that you paid attention to over time, or if, I don't know, just what the pulse of your work was and why it's something that you've given this particular attention, beyond just that it's something that maybe wasn't outrightly being studied.
Yeah, well, part of it is that I saw these lines of convergence between feminist pedagogies and contemplative pedagogies right from the beginning. And and then I looked for other people doing it, and I found Beth. And so it just wasn't being studied. And my fear was that as the field grows, that I wasn't seeing very much feminist work in the field. And I thought, come on, this is just another tool in the toolbox by this point. And that feminist epistemologies, looking at things like Hal was talking about yesterday, about critical first-person pedagogy, about bringing subjectivity in, feminist epistemologists have been doing this work for a long time, and we need to get that heard. So that was the pull. Plus the power of the practices for transformation and for liberating people from suffering. And then from the other side, in my not the contemplative education work so much, but my more purely philosophical work, I don't really. I don't even know if that phrase makes sense, but there, finding non-dualistic frameworks that feminist philosophers are looking for, to find that in the Buddhism, that I was like, there's a framework I can use, and look, this wants to relieve suffering, this wants to relieve suffering, and so the conversation needed to happen. And I'm a practitioner, and I have felt the power of the practices, I think, because of the work I do and the things I've experienced, and so it all sort of comes together. I don't think I've been terribly articulate about it, but.
No, that's what I wanted to know. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. I'm a clinical psychologist where I work with children and families and parents, and I have a background also in a previous incarnation in, not literally, in critical theory and feminist theory. And one point of overlap, it seems to me, between feminist theory and contemplative science is the primacy of subjectivity. Mm-hmm. I think about one line from a feminist psychoanalyst who said that in response to Freud's famous question, what does a woman want? The answer is what a woman wants is to be the subject of her own experience, not the object of others' needs.
Nice, yeah.
And then I think about from a contemplative philosophical framework, sort of the framework that rather than consciousness being a thing in the universe is a thing in consciousness. And then Evan Thompson's work, for example, on sort of cognition as maybe being kind of constitutive rather than a process that emerges. And of course, within contemplative science, some people who take first-person methods seriously, like Alan Wallace, but I guess largely within American science writ large, more of a dominance of a kind of subject versus object paradigm. The investigator in the white coat, often male, and then research subjects. And I'm curious about your thoughts on how the extent to which the operating default paradigm of science, and perhaps even contemplative science, remains very patriarchal.
I'm hoping to change it.
Well,
and I know there are people in this room who are doing that, and I think it's a really good point. You know, there's great feminist philosophy of science that addresses exactly those issues, and that's another thing that we're not hearing much about. Maybe it's going on, maybe everyone's aware of it already, but I don't know because I'm not hearing about it. And so yeah, yes. It's what I'm worried about too, and that's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. What I see in your quotes is that Buddhism may or may not be reconciled with feminism, but Buddhism is undeniably sex negative. And this goes to a matter that has arisen in me as a conflict in this conference in general. Sex is important because how can we reconcile Buddhism with the body, as you were saying, when we deny something as important for our bodies and for our minds as human sexuality? And also, it goes deeper than that because the whole ascetic view of Buddhism as denying not only sexuality but pleasure in general, and is too negative, is centered on the curing of suffering, but not so much on the search of happiness. And I think that basic negativity on Buddhist philosophy for me is a big problem. I don't know if it is for you, and also a long-time Zen practicer.
So that's a really interesting question. When I first encountered Buddhism, it was when I was first encountering feminist philosophy, and I thought, oh, awesome. You know, non-dualism, this is going to be great. And then I found those sutras, and I was like, oh my God. And then I thought, no, because I know from my practice, I don't find it negative, in fact. I don't find a negativity. And so for me, it's about honoring the tradition, which has given me a lot. And I really don't think they're antithetical. And so I I don't find Buddhism to be world-denying or body-denying. I don't think it has to be. I think the questions, I mean, we could have a longer conversation about that. So I'm not sure, that's a really good question.
How do you reconcile it? Because I thought at the beginning, you know, I started practicing Zen in 1984, and I thought, okay, well, you know, just ignore it, it will go away, you know, eventually I will find a way. But then in my real life experiences in Sangha after Sangha, I saw the problem of sexuality and the problem of denying of pleasure coming back up.
That's what you want to talk about. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. Yeah. Wow, that's a big one. And what was that? Go ahead. But it happens in a lot of sanghas, right? I mean, this is a problem that American Buddhism needs to deal with. This is a problem that we need to speak out about. And, you know, I mean, I do not have a short answer to that one.
I practice in Madrid, I practice in Paris, I practice in Washington, D.C., and I practice in Los Angeles. How many sanghas should I try?
Okay. Thank you.
This is a bit similar, but different, I guess. So especially for female practitioners, but anyone really, who are trying to both really take to heart some of the Buddhist perspectives on lack of attachment, on real analysis of how the ego determines our grasping towards pleasure, yet also that, you know, especially with the emergence of kind of contemporary feminism, there's such a celebration of pleasure, of orgasm, of female bodies, and to really embrace that fully and bravely and blissfully, but also recognize our own attachment and somehow reconcile those two as current practitioners. Do you have any ideas?
You know, I think that if we acknowledge that different bodies do the sitting, it makes a big difference. I think that for many women who come to Buddhism, the first thing they need to do, who come to practice, the first thing they need to do is find themselves before they're told to detach from it. And I think that that's a qualitative difference for women walking into a Zendo, for example, and men walking into a Zendo. You cannot give up a subjectivity that you have never been given, that you have never had. And I think that that's one way in which feminist philosophy has a lot to say to the practice of Buddhism for women. And you know, this is something we know teachers have denied, right? If you asked questions, I think it's less so now, but if you asked questions about what does it mean for me to practice as a woman, oh, well, you're attached to gender. You know, we're beyond that here. Well, no, I'm sorry, that's crap. I think that we have to acknowledge that many women walk into meditation centers wounded, without a sense of self, without a subjectivity, and the compassionate thing to do is before to tell them to let go of self and detach, to find their self. Thank you very much. Thank you.